So for the last few weeks, really, starting in Acts chapter 22, we've kind of been looking at the trial of Paul. Paul, the apostle, who's basically in his last missionary journey. And he is now headed to Jerusalem. And once he arrives in Jerusalem, there's an uproar of the people. They're angry with Paul. They accuse him of being an individual that is profaning the temple and the synagogue by bringing in Greeks into the synagogue and the temple. And he's then taken before the religious leaders of the city of Jerusalem. And in the process of this uproar of the Jews, the Romans then have to take over. The Romans see and observe what is taking place. In fact, back in Acts chapter 22, it says the entire city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. And because Jerusalem was obviously part of now a Roman state, in the Roman state of Judea, the Romans have to calm everybody down, see what's going on, see what the problem is, see what the issue is, and try to fix what is taking place in the city. We kind of made note that the last time an uproar like this would have happened for the entire city of Jerusalem would have been when Jesus had come into Jerusalem as well. And the Jews, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the religious leaders were upset with Jesus because they believed he had committed blasphemy. And so what I see from the very beginning here is, as we look at Paul's story, is that there's similarities between Paul as he's walking through this trial, and it kind of throws back to Jesus as he was going through his own trial. Now, we know the author of the book of Acts is the physician Luke. And Luke wrote not only the book of Acts, but also the Gospel of Luke. And there are specific details that are given in both Luke and the book of Acts that I believe tell us that Luke is trying to make the point that Paul is patterning himself after the life of Jesus. And Paul would say this himself, that Jesus is somebody that he is pursuing. I press toward the mark of the high calling of Jesus. And so Luke is describing certain details, and all the way from the beginning, from the fact that Jesus, as he kind of set his face to Jerusalem, you see the comparison to Paul as he kind of was headed and had his face set towards Jerusalem as well. There were warnings by the disciples of Jesus saying, hey, if we go to Jerusalem, like, your life is going to be in danger. And yet Paul also was warned by some of the disciples of Jesus here in the book of Acts. And then even the prophet Agabus would come to him directly and say, hey, if you go to Jerusalem, there is going to be danger. And yet Paul is set. He's set to go into Jerusalem, and just as Jesus was set to go into Jerusalem. And then, of course, the responses there of the religious. They're upset. They're angry with not only Jesus, but they're also angry with Paul here in the book of Acts. And the uproar then comes to the ears of the Romans, just like with Jesus, where his case was brought before Caiaphas and the high priests and the Sadducees, and then it had to be taken before the governor Pilate. Here in Acts chapter 24, Paul's story as well, he's accused by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the high priests and the religious group, and they then have to turn Paul over to the Romans as well. And we'll see that here in chapter 24, we'll see the governor Felix is the one that oversees the trial of Paul here, whereas it was the governor Pilate in Luke's account that was overseeing the trial of Paul. Yes?
How much longer after Jesus is this time?
So this is towards This is towards they say between 30 to 40 years, somewhere in there. There's not like direct indications of the timeline here. Let me see here. So specifically, Jesus would have died in AD 33 AD, somewhere in that vicinity. Ananias, who's the appointed high priest at this time, and that's mentioned here in Acts chapter 24, was presiding as the high priest from AD 47 to AD 58. So that kind of puts you in that timeline there. So it's roughly, I guess, 20 years, 20 to 30 years, somewhere in there. In that timeline is roughly when Acts 24 takes place. So it's not a whole lot of time since Jesus' time, but enough time to where the religious groups has kind of passed on. So it's a different high priest. So even though they have similar names, let's see, Ananias here in chapter 24, the high priest that was involved with the trial of Jesus was Caiaphas, the high priest, as well as Annas, who's indicated. And I kind of like did a little study on that character and was wondering if they're the same individual. They're not. Two separate individuals of Ananias and Annas, but both were high priests in Jerusalem. So that kind of gives you a rough timeline of that. So some Paul, by the way, is able to go before a Roman council in a sense because Paul the apostle was a Roman citizen by birth. And he indicates that in Acts chapter 22 when they go to take him and he says, hey, do you realize you're arresting a Roman citizen? So then all of a sudden, this case turns. The centurion's like, hold on, like I've paid a lot of money to become a Roman citizen. How in the world are you a Roman citizen? And it was by birth. He was born in Tarsus, which is a free city in the Roman province of Syria, to a Jewish Roman citizen. So Paul, because of his birthplace, automatically became a Roman citizen. Well, because his parents were Jewish Roman citizens in the city of Tarsus. So because of his birth, he was a Roman citizen. And so because of that, we see like in the course of chapter 24 here, and we're going to dive in here in just a second, that this trial takes place in the format of a Greek and a Roman trial. So often you'll see in the format of a Roman trial, which by the way, our own American government and judicial system takes a lot of its patterns from the Greeks and the Romans. There's so much when it comes to our structure that comes from the Greco-Roman structure as well. So we'll see here in just a second here, but what often started the conversation in this trial was flattery, and like an orator would stand up and like have this presentation to begin, which like is very similar to like the lawyers today, which have an initial presentation of the case and spelling out with language what has taken place. And so that's what happens here. The accusers would often start their arguments with elaborate praise and flattery towards the judge, highlighting their authority and virtues to gain a positive impression. And then there were the formal accusations. So then the accusations were brought forth following the flattery. The accusers would then present their specific charges against the defendant, outlining the alleged crimes and providing evidence to support their claims. And then the defense was then given the opportunity to respond, which is very similar to our modern courthouse hearings, where then the defense gets to take the stand in a sense, and they get the opportunity to defend themselves by presenting their own arguments and evidence to refute the accusations. And then after basically the prosecution, and then the defense has finished their arguments, then the judge makes the decision. Still, very similar to our process today. So the presiding judge would then ultimately decide the case based on the arguments presented, sometimes with the power to sentence the defendant. So with all that in mind, in the context of what is taking place here, which is now, this is a Roman trial that's taking place here in Caesarea, which is kind of like the capital city of the Roman state of Judea. And so here we are, pick up in verse number 1. And after 5 days, Ananias, the high priest, descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. So here comes this, I would call him like a lawyer of sorts, but he's known as an orator, somebody who speaks well. His name is Tertullus. His character is perhaps a Jew, a Hellenistic Jew, which kind of mixed his beliefs between the Jewish tradition and some of the Greco-Roman beliefs and their systems, or he was perhaps a Roman himself. But in any case, he was assigned by Ananias, the Jews, and the high priests and their council to speak on their behalf towards the governor. So Tertullus stands up. He addresses the governor, and he begins, surprise, with flattery. Verse number 2. And when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness. He's now addressing the governor. O governor, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always, and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. And then there's the indication of the name of the governor, and his name is Felix. So Governor Felix is presiding over this trial. Tertullus begins with his oration in flattery. Verse 4, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee. I mean, just the language in and of itself shows here Tertullus is an orator. He says, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. And so already I feel like if you put your mind in this council, in this trial room, and there's like a hush that comes over as Tertullus begins his introduction and oration. Yes, as Felix, who's sitting there, I imagine on his little seat, and maybe there's some guys close by that are fanning him, and he's accepting the praise. Oh yes, I am the individual that has brought peace to this area. So, which by the way, if you actually looked at the history of what Felix did, this was completely opposite. There was not a lot of peace during his reign. In fact, there was Jewish revolts, and he ended up, if you look at history, he ended up being killed in the process of a Jewish revolt. So Felix being praised here by Tertullus, it is flattery, and sometimes flattery is actually complete lies. So verse 5, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow. So the accusation towards Paul then places him as like this pest. Like he's this plague. He's this sickness that has come in. He says, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow, speaking of Paul, and a mover of sedition. The word sedition there means an uprising or a stirring up of controversy. So he says, first, he's a pestilent fellow. Secondly, he's a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, this is interesting language, because this is actually the first time in the scriptures that this type of language is used for individuals who are followers of Jesus. This is what he's referring to, by the way. These are followers of Jesus. These would have been called in the, I think it was Acts 16, in the city of Antioch, they would have been called Christians. But I think Tertullus wants to avoid the term Christian because the term, the root word of the term Christian in Greek, which is possibly what the language was being spoken here, was Christos, which means anointed one. And for Tertullus to admit and acknowledge that these individuals were followers of the anointed one, I see it as him wanting to not associate himself with that term for this Jesus individual. He doesn't want to even acknowledge that this person is to be considered an anointed one. So yeah, he calls them this sect of the Nazarenes. Now, which is interesting language. So he calls him this ringleader of this cult called the Nazarenes. Now, the Hebrew word that would later be used for this term for Christians, the Hebrews would use this term for Christians, is the Hebrew word notrim. And I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's what they would have begun calling these Christians, these Nazarenes, which we know Jesus was from Nazareth. He was called Jesus the Nazarene, from the city and area of Nazareth. And those who were associated with Jesus would then begin to be called these Nazarenes. What's interesting is later the term Nazrani, which is Arabic, finds itself in the book of the Quran when it refers to Christians, followers of Jesus. In the Quran, they're labeled as Nazarenes or Nazrani in the Arabic reference. So I think it's neat here that there's this language that's used, and a lot of the language, even the term Christian and the term here Nazarenes, or even those of that way, which we'll actually see here in chapter 24 as well, was labels that others put on them. This wasn't something that the disciples of Jesus or followers of Jesus were putting on themselves. They weren't saying, I'm a Christian. They weren't saying, I am a Nazarene. They weren't even saying, I'm a disciple. They were simply saying, look, we are followers, which again is connected to the word disciple, but we are followers of Jesus. And they were saying like, oh, you're followers of that way, which was in the Jews' eyes was heinous, was blasphemous, was completely destroying their whole religious belief system. And for the Greeks and the Romans, it was almost like this rebellious group that was arising in the process. And that's kind of how they're treating this, like this is some type of Jewish revolt. And it was, in a sense, but it wasn't when it comes to, it had nothing to do with flesh and blood. It had nothing to do with them wanting to overthrow the kingdom. It had everything to do with the spiritual kingdom of Jesus and him coming to earth and them declaring this kingdom to the world at that time. So look at verse number 6. This is the continuous accusation of Paul, who also hath gone about to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. This is speaking of the Jews. But the chief captain, Lysias, came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands. This is a Roman captain, by the way. He's indicated in the previous chapters. So verse number 8, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. And the Jews also assented, saying that these things were so. So the governor hears the accusation that comes from Tertullus and those that he represents, Ananias the high priest and the elders of the Jews there. The chief captain here, his name is thrown in here because he was the officer that was overseeing the uproar in Jerusalem and trying to calm everybody down. He was the one that basically indicated we need to take Paul out of this for his own safety, and we need to actually process him as a Roman citizen. And so here they are in this Roman trial. Verse number 10. Now, here comes the defense. Paul is able to give his own defense in this process. By the way, Paul, as a Roman citizen, I believe, acts as a Roman citizen here in a Roman trial that is taking place, and he stands as if he were part of the system. And so I see Paul adjusting himself to the Roman context here. And we'll make note of this later, and I want to indicate, though, that Paul is adjusting himself to the Roman culture and understanding of how this proceeding would go. Paul, then, after that, the governor had beckoned unto him to speak. So, again, the governor turns and beckons to Paul. Okay, I've heard the prosecution, the accusations. I now give you the floor, Paul, to stand and to make your defense. So, Paul, after the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, For as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation. By the way, here's Paul, again, with a little bit of flattery, using the procedure that was customary with the Romans in their proceedings in the trial. He uses a little bit of flattery here. He says, For as much as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. He says, Because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues, nor in the city, neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, by the way, there's that phrase there, the way, which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers. Now, Paul is speaking as a Jew. He's saying, look, they've accused me of following this way that they consider a heresy, but he's saying, look, I am a Jew through and through, and I worship the God of my fathers. Basically putting the connection between the Jesus that he's now following to the Old Testament God that was declared of from the very beginning. And Paul is putting the connection together, saying, look, this is one and the same. This is not a heresy. This is not some new path that I'm like forging. No, this is the one and the same God from the Old Testament that I am still following. He says, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets, and have hope toward God. He didn't like put in a parenthesis there, which point to Jesus. Jesus would say this in Luke 24, that the law and the prophets speak of Jesus himself. And that's really where Paul is making this connection. And have hope toward God, which they themselves also allow that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. By the way, Paul is speaking here towards the Sanhedrin, which was made up of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And there was this argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not believe in a coming resurrection. The Pharisees did believe in a coming resurrection. That was the main divide between the two groups that were in the Sanhedrin, both Jews. One group believed in a resurrection, and the second group did not believe in a resurrection. Paul would actually address some of this later in one of his writings. But this is what Paul is indicating. Look, I am a Pharisee in a sense. I am a follower of the law and the prophets. I believe in a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. Verse number 16. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense toward God and toward men. Now after many years I came to bring alms to my nation and offerings. So Paul indicates that he's been gone for many years. And the truth is, Paul hasn't been back in Jerusalem since he fled originally, years ago. He's been on these missionary journeys, sharing the gospel, and he's now come back into Jerusalem as a Jew. And we see that he was coming for the feast of Passover specifically. He understood that these were his roots. He was still worshiping the same God. He wanted to come back to Jerusalem to offer these alms and his offerings. And we see his heart in the book of Romans, that he had such a passion and a heart for his own people, even though God had called him to the Gentiles. So he comes back, and if you were to look back at the previous chapters, he did go through the process of a vow and purification. Verse 18, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with tumult, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me. So he indicates here, look, there's witnesses that could testify. I did go into the temple, but I came in purified. Under the Jewish law, I had a vow which was on my head. He ended up shaving his head as a part of this vow. And he says, and there are witnesses that could testify about this, that I was there strictly to observe that proceeding. So verse number 20, or else let these same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me while I stood before the council, except it be for this one voice that I cried, standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day. So Felix has now heard the prosecution and the accusation from Tertullus, and he's now hearing and heard the defense of Paul when it comes to his doings in Jerusalem. And then Felix, after hearing these things, we pick up verse 22. And when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, by the way, there's that phrase again, he deferred them and said, when Lysias the chief captain shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. So Felix does not make a decision right away. He says, hold on, I need to call to the stand basically another witness. That is going to be the chief captain, Lysias. For whatever reason, I don't know what the case is, but he was unable to make it here to this trial. And he indicates, before we move forward with the proceedings, we're going to pause this trial, pause this case, until Lysias, the chief captain, is able to come down. And then I will be able to know the uttermost of the matter, the full picture of what is taking place, or has taken place. Verse 23, and he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. So this is really, really interesting here. So after all of this that takes place, there had to be something about Paul's defense to Felix. As Felix is observing all that is taking place, and he hears the accusation, hears the prosecution, and then he hears the defense from Paul. Paul, who seems to have great language here and knowing how to communicate to the Romans, being a Roman citizen himself. He hears Paul. Something begins to stir in his heart. So much so, he says, look, I'm not going to make a decision right now. I'm going to put a pause on this case. I want to bring in Lysias, the chief captain, to add to the testimony here. And while we're waiting on that, I'm going to put you into the hands of the centurion, a Roman centurion, who's going to take care of Paul, house him, keep him under guard, but he's also has a lot of liberty. He's going to be allowed to have visitors. And this is where really some of Paul's letters would come into play, where Paul is in bonds in a sense, but he was given the liberty to have visitors come in, go out, him writing in this process. And so, but Felix takes it a step further. He actually invites Paul to his own house. He says, after certain days, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, and he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And as he reasoned of some topics here, righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered. So I see here Felix who, as you begin to see some of his character and his personality here, I see him kind of as an indecisive individual We see that a little bit from the trial that has taken place. He's got a lot of power, but he also has like a fear of the people, which to me calls back to the similarity between him and Pilate himself, which I think it's interesting that Luke, as the author, kind of lets us take a peek into Felix and even his relationship with his own wife, Drusilla, and that they have an interaction with Paul concerning this way, concerning this Jesus, and concerning righteousness and temperance and the judgment that is to come. And Luke includes these details in here, almost throwing back to Pilate, also a governor, also a peek into his relationship with his wife, and the fact that Pilate was indecisive. He even washed his hands of the decisions that were being made by the people in fear of the people. And so Felix is trembling, and he answers to Paul. He says, "Go thy way," this is middle of verse 25, "Go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee." So Felix doesn't want to make a decision. Again, his personality coming through. I can't make a decision about this now. Let me pause this, just like he paused the trial. Let me put this on pause. Let me think about this. Let me process this. And maybe at a convenient season, I will call for thee. Verse 26. He hoped also. Now we begin to see a little bit more of Felix's character coming through. He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might loose him. Wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communed with him. Now often I've looked at this passage and people will like punch out verse 25 as Felix brushing Paul off, saying, "Go thy way, and at a convenient season I will call you again." But the fact is that Felix did call Paul again, over and over again. It says more and more often, and he was actually looking for a bribe from Paul, saying, "Hey, look, I'm going to hold you, but if you give me some money, then maybe I'll consider releasing you." And so he's wheeling and dealing here. So we see Felix's, just his slyness, he also was convicted by Paul's confrontation of him when it comes to righteousness, temperance, and the judgment to come. He is trembling in response, just like Pilate, I think it says, where it was like he was shaking. His knees were shaking and trembling. He was overwhelmed with fear over the situation, especially after his wife comes to him with the dreams about who Jesus really is. And so we see here this Felix, and yet he tries to suppress all that and still is motivated by his greed and his desire for more and more power, which is probably how he got to his position in the first place. Verse 27, but after 2 years, so two years goes by where Paul is basically on house arrest for this period of time, all because Felix won't make a decision in this. And after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room. And Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So again, Felix submitting to his fear of man, not wanting to upset the Jews, he leaves Paul imprisoned for that entire 2 years so that he didn't upset the Jews at this time. And that's where it pauses again, just like the previous chapters have, and then steps into the next chapter. But this is all just part of the process here. So we see the accusation, the prosecution, we see the defense, we see the judge make a decision, which was, in this case, was no decision at this point. And we see the pattern of the Roman trial as it proceeded through this. And then we see during this waiting period that Felix invites Paul for conversations about this way and about righteousness and judgment to come. He's filled with fear, yet he is trying to suppress that by his greed, that he desires money from Paul to free him. And then Felix continues to have conversations with Paul over that period of 2 years. Yet Felix is money hungry, he's a people pleaser, and he's indecisive. And I already made the comparison to the character of Pilate in the story of Jesus' trial. So, really quick before we go to just some discussion time. The one difference I see between Paul's trial and Jesus' trial, both were set to go to Jerusalem. Both were accused by the religious groups. One, of course, Jesus claiming to be God, one of blasphemy, the other of profaning the temple. They both get taken before a religious court and then handed over to the Romans because of the uproar. They then go before a Roman governor. However, in Jesus' case, which I think is interesting, and I think Paul's desire here is, and maybe I'm reading into this, but I just see and observe that perhaps, and I believe God still continues to use Paul, but perhaps Paul's humanity began to surface in and through this process. Paul was not Jesus. Paul was a man, a human, just like you and I. And as he's going through his life being endangered, he then utilizes his Roman citizenship to try to call for his defense. And again, God would still use this whole process, but he stands to defend himself and make speeches towards the courtroom there, and conversation with Felix himself in the process. But just as I see his humanity maybe coming to the surface of Paul beginning to think about, my own safety, and maybe, this is true. Maybe my life is in danger, and maybe in the back of his mind, he's thinking, I need more time. I want to share more about the gospel. I need to tell more people. There's more Gentiles for me to reach. Perhaps that is in the back of his mind as well. But I see that this is where I feel like the trial of Jesus and Paul's trial diverge a little bit. I see Jesus, who stands before Pilate. The Old Testament scriptures would say, as a lamb before the slaughter, he was dumb. He had no defense. He didn't try to call for witnesses to defend himself before this council. When Pilate asked the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" and he simply responds with, "Well, you said it. Thou sayest it." Jesus doesn't try to use his roots or his upbringing or his background to gain a defense in this situation. And that's why we can make an observation, we can have some discussion even around this. The difference between Paul's trial and Jesus' trial, Jesus was submitted to the entire process. Of course, Jesus knowing that the end of this would be the cross. I think that's the difference as well between Jesus' trial and Paul's trial. Paul did not know what was coming. Jesus did. Paul did not know what the purpose of perhaps his death would be. Jesus knew exactly what the purpose of his death, his coming death would be. It would be the ultimate sacrifice of the Lamb for all mankind. So we'll pause there when it comes to the study of Acts for some discussion time.